Hello and welcome everybody to the Decentralized Tech Livestream. This is the premiere episode of this. As some of you may know, I have been doing programs on Web3 gaming, artificial intelligence, and also general game development, going back to all the styles, MMOs and first-person shooters, all those stuff we love going way back. So this is an expansion of that. We're going to be talking about cryptography, DPIN, DeFi, everything basically. So I'm so excited because for this kickoff episode, I've been able to get a couple of folks from one of my absolute favorite companies in the space, one who has really led the way with DPIN and that frankly I learned a lot from as we thought about the DPIN strategy for Beamable. So first, I'm Jon Radoff. I'm the CEO of Beamable. We build gaming infrastructure for people to have a back end for their games without having to build all that stuff themselves. We're building a DPIN around that tech stack, and I'm accompanied by Oscar, who's going to help me produce this, just like he does all of these episodes. But I'd love to welcome my friends from Aethir, Paul and Kartik. Paul, why don't you introduce yourself, and then Kartik will ask you to introduce yourself, and then we'll dive right in.
Sure, yeah. Great to be here. Thanks for having us, John, and I'm thrilled to be joined by my colleague, Kartik, as well. So thanks, Kartik, also for joining us. I'm Paul Thind. I'm the Chief Revenue Officer of Aethir. I've basically been with the company for about 2 years. I'm also kind of wearing another hat, which is running our games division, which is a business unit within Aethir. As I'm sure you're aware, with all the activities that we have going on, we do have multiple business units under the Aethir umbrella. So I'm responsible for basically outreaching, educating the game developers that want to come onto our platform. Been in gaming for about 25 years now. Started off in free-to-play and then moved kind of to a lot of different companies and solutions over the time. But I'm sure we'll get into that over the course of the hour.
Fantastic. Kartik.
Yes, thanks for having me. Super excited to be here. My name is Kartik. I work on special projects at Aethir, so I'm the strategy lead here. Pretty much built out the entire Web3 ecosystem in the last 1 year since I joined early last year, I think in Feb, right before the node sale, where we raised like $168 million. So initially I was brought in to lead the node sale, then built out the Web3 ecosystem, and eventually transitioned into just special projects around the Web3 degen stuff. So I'm totally opposite of what Paul does. He focuses on actual revenue. I focus on what the degens love us. This basically helps both the Web2 and Web3 communities in line for Aethir.
Excellent. Thanks, Kartik. Let's start at the highest level of DPIN. So I know that I have a lot of people from gaming, from AI, from Web3 gaming even. Not everybody knows about DPIN. It's still kind of a little bit of a niche category, but it's growing super fast. You guys are totally leading the way in terms of that growth. I mean, Paul, you're ahead of revenue for a Web3 project. That's unheard of, like a project that actually makes money. So let's actually start with DPIN, like what it means. So it stands for Decentralized Physical Infrastructure Networks. I'd love you to talk about this because I'm always the one explaining what DPIN is to people, but I've been learning from you. I want to give you the floor here. Paul or Kartik, feel free to jump in. Describe the category and explain why it's different and why, as a blockchain-based technology, this is the game changer that allows us to grow these networks so quickly.
Sure. I can start and then turn it over to Kartik. I can frame the first part in the kind of about what we do at Aethir. So we aggregate compute from tech companies or enterprises, tier 3 and tier 4 data centers into our kind of enterprise-focused GPU as a service compute marketplace. So there was a lot of, let's unpack that a little bit. If you take platforms such as Uber or VRBO, in Uber's case, they don't own any of the cars, but as a passenger, a customer, you can use the platform to choose, whichever different type of car you want to get to where you need to get to. It's a similar kind of thing with Aethir, right? We have about 400,000 GPUs on the platform that we've procured on our supply side from, several, like I said, tier 3, tier 4 data centers, all enterprise focused. And essentially, in about 95 countries, we take that and put that onto the platform. We reward them with our token, which is ATH. They can stake their infrastructure and then make it available to game developers or AI app developers that want it. As that leads into what DPIN, what I guess would be advantageous for DPINs, is really that from there the user of this hardware can it's much more cost efficient because we're getting it at we don't own it, right? So we haven't invested in it. We do bring it onto the platform and then reward the supply holders. So essentially, because they're staking against our token for a longer term period, they're getting a bunch of rewards to be able to basically put the infrastructure on our platform. So from a cost basis, it's a lot cheaper. From scaling up basis, it's a lot easier with decentralized physical infrastructure. There's a lot of flexibility because game developers and AI app developers can kind of dynamically adjust their GPU usage based on their project requirements, scaling up or scaling down. Usually don't get that with a hyperscaler where you're probably committed to a much longer term contract, for example. And then there's global accessibility. Like Ed said, 95 countries, you can access this GPU from anywhere with an internet connection. So when it comes to remote collaboration or accessing GPUs regardless of their geographical location, this can certainly enhance productivity. So that's kind of how, I guess, Aethir plays into DPIN, but I can turn it over to Kartik for more of a definition on the space, if that's okay.
Yeah, Kartik, what would you add?
Yeah, really, really well covered from Aethir's perspective. Like generally, just zooming out a bit, right? When we talk about DeepN, like first of all, I might be biased here because literally one of the few categories I believe has the true potential to merge the Web 2 and Web 3 world. Now coming back to DeepN, right? What is DeepN? It's decentralized physical infrastructure network, right? A lot of people say like DeepN is not even like decentralized to a lot of extent. It's more like distributed, but then it boils down to the definition of decentralization itself, right? We know decentralization is a spectrum. Now with DeepIn, what we're trying to do is like taking a very simple example, as Paul said in context of Aether, it's like let's say Airbnb for GPUs or something comparable to an Uber or whatever. You can take a very simple example, right? Let's say you have a Tesla, everybody can relate to that, and then people would be like requiring to charge their Tesla with the Tesla chargers and all that, right? Now that's a physical hardware device. You can basically connect all those devices into one network and have some sort of shared energy system or incentive system or whatever, right? Where different people can contribute to the supply, different people can come in, have access to the demand, and so on. Now, if you see the actual hardware itself, it's not in the blockchain, right? Those are actual machines that exist in the real world. So what exactly is DeepIn? What is on the blockchain? This is where complications come in. This is where players like Aether are basically like leveraging the benefits of blockchain wherever they can, right? In our case, for example, we have our validator node system. This is the checker node sale that we did last year. So there are like a couple of major use cases, obviously the checker nodes, the tokenomics, and so on. So with the checker nodes, for example, what we're doing is we are validating the entire network, tracking proof of location, proof of bandwidth of all these GPUs, which are across the globe, right? So that's a real world use case right there. Then with the tokenomics, if you do it right, then you can have so much advantage in basically bootstrapping your supply, right? Achieving that critical mass, which is like very difficult in the starting. And how do you even try to compete with the likes of AWS or GCP, right? They already have so much market share. But this is where like you can do fun stuff with tokens, encourage some sort of bootstrapping of supply, and then like get demand and generate a flywheel effect from there, right? So essentially, coming back to a question around Deepin, it literally depends on how people are using Deepin in their particular companies. But end of the day, very simply speaking, for me, it's merging the Web 2 stack with the Web 3 stack wherever there are actual synergies.
Yeah, I love the way you simplify the description down because I'm learning from you in real time here because first of all the comparison to Airbnb or Uber, like because this has been a meme for 10 years now. It's like Airbnb owns no hotel rooms, Uber owns no cars, right? But it's kind of the same. That's what DPIN is. DPIN owns no hardware. It creates the network that aggregates it together. It seems so. I get asked the question though, like, why token though? Why blockchain? You pointed to a little bit of it, Kartik, around the ability to create these different incentive structures and align the incentives across the network, because there's a lot of complexity in not only bootstrapping supply but validating the network. To me, it comes down to composability and the ability to build things on top of the network much more easily, and to have value exchange even between partners that wouldn't necessarily be willing to cooperate, because in blockchain you can have everybody play on a level playing field. Their trust is not really a thing. You eliminate the requirement for trust actually by using a lot of blockchain technologies. But really, it comes down to blockchain's ability to do the value exchange at all and do it at the protocol level, which if you don't have that, then you're leveraging financial institutions that then get to insert themselves and dictate rules, and they start to get to decide who gets to play. In the case of DPIN, they get to decide what data centers are going to participate or not. And they get their pound of flesh, and the pound of flesh tends to only go up over time and remove efficiency from the network. So I think some of those things are arguments in favor of a tokenized economy with blockchain, but I'm curious just to hear your own take on that. Like, so, why token? Why token for Aethir?
Yeah, 100% exactly that. See, from a first principles perspective, we have to understand now, if you are doing something in a decentralized fashion, there are multiple stakeholders involved, right? Now talking about Aether itself, let's say we have the supply side of things and the demand side of things. So supply side are your GPU compute providers, and demand side is where the revenue is coming from, right? Where this compute is getting used, which in our cases is mostly in gaming and AI. These are the two components of any marketplace which people understand. What people don't understand is when you talk about blockchain or decentralization, multiple more stakeholders get added into the network, right? So now you have stakers that basically secure your network, right? You have these checker node operators that are validating the network. So you have to make sure when you have these multiple stakeholders involved, all trying to achieve the same goal of increasing the access, increasing the security, or even like taking compute to the edge. How do you incentivize each player in the ecosystem, right? And then how do you do it better than the web 2 world? Otherwise, what exactly, see, fundamentally cloud is not really broken in web 2, right? It's not that like cloud works just as fine. It's just trying to improve that from a business perspective, from an economics perspective, and making sure you try to give the power in the hands of the user, making sure all the contributing stakeholders get to earn out of it, right? So this is just like an economics play there. So now when we have these multiple stakeholders involved, it's important to use your token in a very efficient way. And this is where a lot of projects struggle, because it looks easy on the outside. You can do it well for 1 year, but then how do you create a sustainable tokenomics model outside it, right? Because you have these token emissions which create sell pressure, which creates downward price on the token. Then how do you even make it like relevant going after 2 years, 4 years, or whatever, right? So you have to make sure you incentivize all the ecosystem players enough to achieve that like critical mass to cross the chasm, making sure they get attracted by your business model, but also make sure these rewards of whatever kind, be it to suppliers, be it to like stakers or whatever, they have some sort of a diminishing model where, let's say, people understand Bitcoin having how rewards keep on like getting halved every 4 years for the miners, right? So you have to implement certain sorts of intelligent mechanisms in your tokenomics to make sure it still remains sustainable in the long term as well. This is where I feel 99% of the Web3 companies struggle with efficient tokenomics, right? Um, so yeah, essentially it's just to like create incentives for everyone, make sure everyone feels a part of the ecosystem, they feel as owners of the ecosystem, and then the ethos of blockchain come into place.
Yeah, an inherent problem with projects in Web3 generally is like they put out a token and then they do yield farming and all these things on top of it. So there's more and more tokens entering the supply, but no real demand to actually use the token, right? So one of the things that I think is really unique about Aether, even within DPIN, by the way, DPIN, generally speaking, has a lot of projects that are aspirational and don't have a lot of substance, frankly, behind them. It's not to say that they're bad projects. All startups start that way. So this isn't a knock on it, but just in terms of where this market is today, I think it's true that 99 point something percent of the projects in DePIN are focused on either designing a protocol, getting some supply onboarded, and they're going to worry about demand later. One of the things I really learned from Aethir in watching you guys was that focus on the demand side, and that you were signing up real customers who needed access to GPU, for example. That's one piece I learned. The other piece was the quality of the supply you were signing up. So I think sometimes people think about this Airbnb model and they believe that that means, well, okay, anybody gets to join the network, anybody gets to have their crappy computer in mom's basement supply compute back to the network. And that's also the wrong idea. Like, good DePIN projects are thinking very intelligently about the rollout of the different node types. So for example, like checker nodes, or what we call validator nodes at DePIN at Beamable, could be offered to everybody because there aren't very onerous compute requirements for that, versus say the container nodes where workloads actually occur. Well, there you need high bandwidth, you need good reliable compute, it has to be secure, like a lot of the things associated with typical data centers. So you can run a decentralized network even though you put a high bar on who gets to participate for the things where a high bar is required. So I learned a lot about how you were thinking about both the supply as well as generating the demand side kind of concurrently. And that's when it clicked for me, because I think if you had asked me a few years ago at Beamable what our decentralization plan was going to be, I had an initial vision of, yeah, we're going to decentralize everything. Everybody can just run compute on the network and it will be like Roblox, but all of the compute hardware on the back end could run anywhere. And I actually do want to get to that someday. It feels like it's probably a few years down the road, just because the security and the quality of service requirements for that become really, really complicated. And it would hold us back for years if we said that was the initial mainnet release. So we've kind of followed some of your lead in that all of the data center capacity has to be basically top tier, like bare metal capacity at reliable providers. Validator nodes can run all over the place. But more importantly, we've got 5 years in this business of building out demand. Like, we've got a couple million players playing the games on the network already, not to mention thousands of developers, hundreds of games in the pipeline. So just comment a little bit about that. Like, you guys were really early in this market, and you were building demand from the beginning. Maybe it's a fall question because you're doing
no.
Right?
Yeah. It is one of the reasons that got me to join Aethir, because I think this focus on enterprise grade GPUs is much harder, right? Like a random person with like a 3090 in their garage, it might work for rendering a 3D scene overnight, but it's not going to work for streaming like a AAA game to 100,000 users in real time or something, right? So actually, as you mentioned, uptime SLAs, kind of redundant power networking, high-speed internet with low latency, these performance guarantees that these enterprise-level customers. I mean, you're obviously, in one way you're competing with the hyperscalers, but in another way,
we're totally competing with the hyperscale. Yeah. Like, I'm happy to say that what we're building is a virtual hyperscaler. Really, it comes back to that, Airbnb or Uber strategy, but applied to cloud. But I think maybe you are getting to the point that, like, yet anyone can play in it. Like Amazon is going to be a node operator in Beamable's DePINs. That's fine. I think their price point is probably only going to kick in capacity at like super spike periods for certain games. Yeah. Google was super eager to have nodes too. Again, I think similar kind of challenge. I think you're saying that like anybody can play, like a hyperscaler can be on a DePIN. It's competitive and co-opetition at the same time.
Oh yeah. I mean, definitely, and I think that's starting to become apparent based on the fact that they probably won't have any Web3 components in their business. That's one. Two is they're way too centralized and they can't maybe get on the edge in a different market where we might have infrastructure. So I don't see that so much as a competition, but almost like partnerships, right? Which is a good thing for cloud being on the edge, doing all that stuff. But yeah, coming back to the point, I guess, of, the way that, dealing with just like the quality of the GPU you were talking about. I mean, it really is because, the enterprise grade, the customers themselves, a major publisher, for example, they probably won't risk their game launch on a GPU that might overheat, in someone's bedroom, right? So it's really important, I think. Also on the efficiency of what I was talking about with edge distribution, it kind of requires this really careful coordination, not just random availability on a network, right? So enterprise providers or suppliers, they're just better equipped to deploy at scale in edge-friendly environments. And that's where I think the decentralized model really works for this. And then to your point, John, yes, you can literally partner with, a hyperscaler and either use, like, I don't know, a company in our example, like Aethir for maybe your baseline capacity. And then if you're doing kind of dynamic scaling, you could work with the hyperscaler on top of that. It just depends on the project, the type of customer, what their needs are, what they want to pay, obviously, and all those kind of things.
So I'd love to spend a little bit more time on the use cases for Aether too, just for people who may even be learning about you for the first time. As I understand it, AI inference and pixel streaming are a couple of major use cases. I'm also interested in the intersection between that and the geographic distribution that you're talking about, because that's a really good point about DPIN, which is even the biggest cloud service providers out there are not necessarily experts at every economy and every region where you might want to deploy hardware, and having people on the ground who are really part of those economies and can boot up businesses in those areas is an interesting dimension of DPIN, which is it has a much better potential to create a economically viable network with broad geographic saturation. Well, you're thinking about that topic. I also just wanted to invite our audience to be part of the questions here too. So a long time ago, I don't know, 3 years ago, 2 or 3 years ago, I was doing YouTube videos and we pre-recorded everything and it was edited and all that stuff. But I don't do that anymore. I do live streams. And the reason I do live streams is because you, the audience, are here and you can be part of this conversation. So right now at this moment, we got 440 people tuning in to this conversation on Aether. And this is your opportunity to learn about DPIN, to ask Aether questions. You got a couple of the most senior people from Aether present here, and you could learn anything you want about this project. So use it as an opportunity just to post your questions to the channel. And by the way, we could even make you get here live. So if you wanted to join the conversation live, you got something pertinent to this conversation, Oscar can DM you the information on how to connect to StreamYard. But at least, try to come up with a question or two that said, I'm good at asking questions and keeping it moving forward.
Yeah, and while that's happening, I'd love to talk about some of the use cases, like getting back here on gaming side, obviously where I'm most well versed. I'd certainly say the direct to consumer side is getting super interesting. Developers and publishers who want to stream their games directly from I would say our cloud. There's on the user side, there's no need for players to download or install, right? So games run in the cloud, they're streamed instantly to mobile, browser, or TV. Zero friction onboarding, higher player retention. It's a way to reach low-end devices, which is kind of how we started. Gaming is in our DNA. The idea was that if there's a user in LATAM or Southeast Asia that, just doesn't have the latest smartphone or the latest PC, they can still play the game, right? So I think the streaming side really took off. Pixel streaming side took off in Asia first, with a lot of publishers who were experimenting with models as they do, right? Asia's always led the charge with free to play first, then Web3, and then obviously now with streaming. And I think that's super interesting. But other use cases that we see in gaming at least are with playable game trailers or demos. So basically, no install, no queue. A developer can serve the demo during Steam sales or festivals or NFT drops, and then just let players kind of try before you buy or try before you download, right? So that's streamed instantly from the edge. If you think about it, a game developer might not have a ton of money to do soft launches or all these different things. So I think it just adds that community element, which is interesting. But you could also monetize that in really interesting ways, right? Like we have customers that monetize battle passes where you can add the ability to play the game on any device. So you don't have to keep kind of fire up your high-end PC every time you're wanting to play that game. And then, in-game AI agents, NPCs, when you're running real-time AI inference for, advanced NPCs or voice interactive characters directly from the GPU network, there's no need to ship kind of large AI models with the client, right? So you can stream that also from the edge, like Skyrim NPCs powered by GPT style models, served from the edge in real time. All of that becomes super possible. And then, the other use case that I really like is game testing. How like the, you kind of have to download Test Flight, and then you've got a, client version of the game sitting there out there somewhere with some game tester. With the cloud, I mean, decentralized cloud particularly, you can simulate thousands of game sessions, right? Running on decentralized GPUs to test for balance, bugs, behavior prediction using AI agents, so, stress testing the game in a real world GPU environment before launch. I mean, I think there's a ton of value in that. So yeah, I mean, like if you think about it, the way that I think the demand side, customers sometimes come up with their own use cases, but I think what we've been trying to do, at least on the gaming side, to be honest, is really take this technology and really look at what's happening in gaming in general from a macroeconomic standpoint, right? You've got it's we're hurting as an industry. It's a compound annual growth rate post COVID is dipping. We're seeing layoffs, etc. But if you look at user acquisition costs, all-time highs, right? If you look at infrastructure costs, all-time highs, and then if you look at the platform fees, the 30%, that's not going away anytime soon. So if you can launch the game yourself in the cloud with a much cheaper solution like Aethir, which is decentralized, and obviously the cost basis will be 40-50% cheaper, you're going to save on the infrastructure cost. The second is user acquisition cost, right? Because you'll be sending everybody to a web link as opposed to the app stores. So it helps for discoverability. And then the third is you're not paying that 30% tax. So in my mind, if I was to hypothesize, as I've been in game publishing forever, if we can, really, hone in on these problems and use the technology to solve them, then I think it becomes an incredibly viable and interesting model for the P&L holders and the gaming execs that are constantly trying to figure out how to launch their games into all sorts of different countries and geographies, and I'm really liking what we're seeing. There used to be the AAA typical game exec North American, they'd say, oh, I only get all my money from, and I'm sure you, John, you've heard this many times, I only get all my money from the US and tier 1 European countries, right? And now it's becoming possible, you're seeing the rise of India as a great market and the rise of the middle class in all these other markets. Where gaming, is global. So you can't really launch something and not have the ability to reach every customer on every device, right? But now you finally do. And so I think all these use cases for gaming, at least, are great. I mean, I can get into AI ones, but I don't want to dominate the floor here too.
Well, I do want to talk about AI ones a little bit, but the thing I just want to really flag there is that DPIN isn't just about getting better economics and aggregating supply, and it's also about being fundamentally disruptive. And what I mean by that is the economics change so substantially, and the ease of access to the network is opened up so broadly that you actually invent new ways, or you unlock new ways of utilizing the same technology. So you were just pointing to, well, it's not just a way to play the same games that you could play otherwise, maybe in a new geography, but it's also things like finding out new distribution mechanisms for games, try before you buy and all of that, and making that much more accessible. So that actually launches whole new ways that we could be selling and marketing games. It's interesting because when I remember talking to Stadia years ago,
Yeah.
And I'll tell you what Google told me. They actually tipped their hand for a moment and told me why they were really doing Stadia. And I don't know why they couldn't do Stadia, to tell you the truth. I don't know what really went implosion there. But what they told me is like Stadia was really about turning video games into a performance ad business. meaning that as soon as they could just plug games into ad units and distribute it through the Google network so that it becomes as simple as click this and then associate that with a purchase event later
Yeah.
on, that would be magical for them, for
Yeah.
games, because you eliminate all these other middlemen and Steam and buying games. Basically, they become the way you buy games from now on. So that was actually the true vision for Stadia, which was how do we create an ad unit around video games? I think there actually is some good reasons to want to do that if you're a video game developer. If you could actually track your marketing spend, that's a good thing. But you're actually making this technology accessible for the first time, which I think is super interesting. At Beamable, the thing that we found and discovered along the way is once you have the DPIN infrastructure in place, you can really utilize the composability of that network to start offering additional solutions as well. So one of the things that we're rolling out in our DPIN is not just our own SDK for building games, but we found all these dozens of other partners who have solutions from matchmaking to private server orchestration, all these different use cases that game servers and game studios always end up needing. But it's really hard to broadly distribute that technology because you end up customizing it every single case for whatever cloud, whatever bare metal service provider, whatever code base they're on. And we're unlocking for these guys the ability to actually be part of our network and get their solutions rolled out without having to even think about that anymore, which means that they now actually compete with some of the proprietary products of in Azure or Amazon, AWS, and so forth. So I think that's probably the thing to watch that everybody who's interested in decentralized technology should pay super close attention to, which is, yes, the economics are better. You have concepts of self-sovereignty and this sort of more libertarian network where everybody can come in a permissionless basis. That's all cool. But the real interesting and disruptive thing is all the new solutions that got unlocked by that. And Paul, you just spoke to some. Love to talk about AI too. Like, is that happening with AI applications? And because that's your other market, right? Is AI inference with DPIN?
Yeah. I mean, our awesome CTO runs that business unit. But yeah, I mean, look,
we'll get him on in the future.
We will. Yeah,
he can give us the high level.
I've introduced him to Oscar as well to get that moving. But essentially, yeah, distributed model training. If you look at training a language model across thousands of nodes, without centralized control, that's super interesting. I think synthetic data generation. So like rendering photorealistic scenes. I mean, I would think that if you could simulate user, edge cases and create kind of synthetic data sets for AI training, using 3D engines on Aethir GPUs, that's interesting. So an example would be like autonomous vehicle startups that can simulate thousands of driving hours in the cloud, right? So, I use Waymo now, so it's kind of, like that's super interesting.
Waymo.
Yeah, exactly. But yeah, like, smart agents we always talk about on the gaming side. Wanted to also talk a little bit back to what you were saying about Google Stadia and that particular case. We're getting a ton of interest in that in gaming, on the try before you buy, and we should talk about AI. But so I'll certainly mention that we've actually done case studies which we've launched. I think there was one around GDC timeframe. We're working on several others, and it's really validating the the user journey, right? Which is really, if you allow a user to stream or try a game before they download it, the metrics are so much better. So the KPIs, basically top of funnel, you're going to see that 50% better conversion on a streaming game versus download anyway. On click-through rate over, over a download game, you're getting something higher. But the interesting thing in our research was that when the user starts going down funnel, if they started streaming the game at the beginning, all the metrics are way higher. So it was like 60% D1 retention. It was 80% D7. It was like 93% better average. There's average revenue per user increase with streaming, and all these other metrics that are in the case study. But ultimately, it really made.
I just have to pause that for a second, Paul, because the numbers you just said are insane. Like, that's not numbers you hear in gaming. Like, I think I heard you say something around the lines of, was it 60 or 80% D1 retention?
Let me see if I can actually present that. Yeah, because this is pretty exciting. But yeah, it was 60% D1 retention.
So just to give some folks who are tuning in, we might have some game folks here, we might have some non-gaming folks present. If you're building a game and you can do over 25% D1 retention, you probably are economically viable. You might be good. If you hit 40%, like you're in business. Like that's a really solid, like free to play game if you can hit those kind of numbers. And almost no one gets like 40%.
You might want to explain what D1 means. Just
the first day, the day after you've installed, did you come back the next day? Is really all that means. Did you remember it? Did you go to sleep, wake up the next day, and remember you still want to play that game?
Yeah. And D7 means obviously the seventh day of that, you know. So, but these are big, interesting metrics because it's not just you would hypothesize the biggest thing would be the conversion rate on top of the funnel because you're getting into the game quicker. But actually, the funny thing is, and I always had this hypothesis as well that, and you know, for lack of a better word, TikTok generation, you know, the newer, you know, Gen Z and Alpha might not want to put their data into an app store game like that. They might not want to, you know, download and wait, right? It's a 15-second attention span you've got, right? So it's kind of like, let me play the game. So to your point, John, you know, when you were talking about Google and playables, you know, making, you know, maybe they were onto something, but obviously back then Stadia, you know, still had, you know, a lot of issues. But yeah, like the case study, I believe Dean Takahashi wrote about it too on VentureBeat. So it was like with Scooper Scale and this very mobile casual game called Tiny Tower. But essentially, it just showed that they have in-app purchases, they have you know, ads as well. But every metric was phenomenal down funnel. So that's where I think, you know, we really started to see an opportunity to help. And we, you know, let's talk even about PC games. You know, if you look at the Epic Game Store, I mean, you know, a great use case there is try before you buy, right? So if these metrics are proving themselves out, that you know, with streaming and it's cheap. And you can, you know, use it as a viable, even a demo marketing type model. It becomes a pretty viable part of the business to launch any game, really.
Yeah, Paul breaking out the real numbers in Web3, which never happens. Here's sort of the interesting thing that I think both of us share in common, and generally the bigger DPIN projects that are doing better all share in common, which is, yes, DPIN is a Web3 technology in the sense that it uses blockchain and it has a protocol and there's a token for value exchange. And you have these node operators that either validate or provide workloads for various operations of the network. That's where Web3 exists, but you don't have to be Web3 to be a user or customer of that network. So Helium, for example, recruits all kinds of people who they don't know anything about blockchain, but you can attach to the Helium network. In fact, they've done deals with like T-Mobile, and you don't even know that you've got blockchain in the back end. With Aethir, if you're playing a game that's streamed to you, you don't know that there's some kind of Web3 enabled back-end DPIN network that's coordinating game servers and pixel streaming out to you. You're just playing a game and having fun, and you're probably just appreciating that you can play it. Beamable, similarly, like we think about onboarding people to Web3 not so much as convincing every game studio out there to change their business model, right? Like that's really hard to get people to change business models that they have expertise around. I think there will be a number of Web3 game studios that are super successful because they've natively implemented new business models, but there's still going to be a $200 billion game industry that's mostly building games the same way. You're addressing that demand through pixel streaming technology that doesn't enforce anything on the end user from a blockchain standpoint. Similarly, if you need game servers to operate your game, like you'll be onboarded to Web3 as a game studio just in the back end, but your end user isn't going to care any more than they might care to use MongoDB or MySQL or whatever your database persistence layer is, right?
This is actually a great point. Like if you look at the way we you know, who we sell to, I mean, if you look at the business, I mean, as Kartik rightly so kind of, you know, drew a bit of a line between kind of what I do, which is more, I deal with Web 2 customers, if you think about it. So the way I think through Aethir is really just a Web 2 platform with some tokenomics on the supply side, right? But that's not the whole story here. It's much bigger than that. And so, to your point, even customers don't have to deal with that if they don't want to, right? They can buy from us in fiat currency. They can buy infrastructure from us at a cheaper rate, bare metal infrastructure or virtual machines with our streaming tech on it, at just a much cheaper rate. And when you look at that in the buying experience, that's kind of, there's some people that don't want to deal with that. But let's talk about the Web3 side, because you said people like the community doesn't have to deal with that if they don't want to. But the interesting part is with Aethir that they can, right? So the tokens make it possible to run the decentralized network without central authority. Node operators might be required to stake the tokens to ensure like good behavior, if they under, and so that helps with the reputation and security of the network and quality control. And then, this idea of decentralized governance, you can't really do that in Amazon, right? Like, you can have a community-driven roadmap this way. You can, it can align with the interests. So, what Kartik is doing, I think, and how he built this ecosystem, in the early days and even now, I think is so important to the actual, like you said, onboarding of people to get interested in Web3, because there's so many touch points where they could actually get involved, right? And then, there's so many exchanges now, and then, for better or worse, this new administration that's supposed to be more crypto friendly. I mean, and all these.
I heard Trump game is coming now, so I don't know. They're deep in.
Exactly, and all these technologies and onboarding, like Magic Eden, they bought that app the other day, that allows you to buy tokens and participate in exchanges, and to me, I think, to your point, I think it's becoming interesting, and I think with Aethir there are very many community touch points that I'm sure Kartik can go into more detail on, but that's what makes it interesting even from a game launch perspective, right? Like if there's a community member in our ecosystem and they get airdropped like an NFT from a gaming partner that is using the Aethir network, I mean, that's a pretty cool thing that you can't really replicate at a decentralized cloud or a hyperscaler, right? Like, this is a very different way of launching. And this is a very different way of involving community.
So, Paul and Kartik, we have some really interesting questions coming in from the audience here. So I'm going to throw some of these on the screen. But so first of all, Alessandro is pointing to, he plays streaming games on Xbox. And I think he's basically saying he's not thrilled with the video quality all of the time. I guess the question comes down to, are you finding that a DPIN-based solution can be better than that? Is the geographic distribution that you can accomplish with DPIN, that sounds like it can be a lot better than just sort of like centralized streaming servers? Is that making a difference at this point in terms of quality of service that your customers are, not the customers, the actual player of the games are able to get at?
Yeah, look, I mean, let's be honest. In any cloud-based streaming solution, you're going to have, you might have some jittery or stuff or some latency, but the job is to really solve for that. And the way you solve for that is exactly what you said, John, because you know this space so well, is being on the edge, and the best way to do that cheaply is to use a decentralized network, right? Because you can't be streaming, the game from, some centralized data center that's, in a completely different state that's 10 states away, and the experience just isn't good. I think this is why, to be honest, streaming took off in Asia better than it did in the States. Because if you look at Southeast Asia, if you look at Korea, you look at bandwidth and internet speeds versus rural Wisconsin. I mean, the person in rural Wisconsin has been forced to buy consoles because of the quality, right? And then you can't really charge for that if the quality is not good. So I think this is the first time we're seeing, in the industry in general, Sony and Microsoft and everybody saying, I mean, I can't believe it's 2025 already, because they're saying by 2028, 29, this is going to be content, the way we deliver content, right? And to be honest, it makes a lot of sense, because Gen Z and Alpha grew up with Spotify and Netflix. So what's third? It's gaming, right? And Netflix is playing that game as well. So to me, it makes sense. I mean, what we try to do, just to answer that person's point, is really talk to the actual publisher. And if they have the best idea of where geographically their users are, that's where we want to spin up the data center. And that's what you can't do with centralized infra.
Right. Good point. We've got an interesting comment from Andrew here. Andrew, your comment got a little cut off at the end because it was long, but I think I get the point, which is you're working on this really interesting project around coordination of logistics, disaster, emergency response using AI. First of all, bless you. Sounds like an important project that will be really, really life-saving to people, actually. So that's amazing. You're talking about the ability to access infrastructure even when it's degraded in a situation where the first responders do not have heavy-duty GPUs on their own device. So I guess your particular use case requires some kind of AI inference to take place, which may need to be cloud-based for a lot of these users. Now, if the network's offline, that sounds like a problem, but how do you, I think the question really comes down to, is AI inference going to become a lot more accessible in the coming years, or maybe even already, by gaining access to AI inference backends? Because right now, if you build a project, say, around an LLM like OpenAI's or Anthropic's or whatnot, you're always going through centralized gateways for those APIs, and you will always be hostage to whether their service is online at that time and whatever they want to do with the business model. Whereas with a more decentralized infrastructure, you potentially are deploying your AI workloads at the inference level, like you're actually talking to your model directly on GPUs in the cloud, and then through decentralization, hopefully it's on GPUs very close to you. That makes it, supports low latency as well as better economics. Paul, this comes back. I know you're more on the gaming side than the AI side, and we're going to bring your CTO on in the future here to talk AI specifically. But I've got to assume that just as we can find all these use cases that are becoming economically viable, as we've discussed, just within gaming and game distribution, similarly, a lot of AI-based use cases are going to become much more accessible and viable in a DPIN-based AI backend, as opposed to what you have to do now, which is either have direct access to a lot of your own iron and you just stand it up yourself, or you go to really expensive hyperscalers, or you find a third-party service provider to run it for you, which is also expensive. Paul, Kartik, feel free to comment on that.
I'll just jump in on that part. The expense part is really, the reason for utilizing Aethir, right? Because if you're talking about GPU time on AWS or Azure, it's very costly. Demand is exploding, of course, but it's controlled by a few centralized players, right? OpenAI, Google, NVIDIA's DGX Cloud. There is limited. It's limited by location and access. So the availability of those GPUs can be maybe like region specific or restricted. You don't have that problem with us. And then it's probably just built for enterprises. So what you're doing there, and this is one of the biggest reasons I love Aethir, is that you're stifling innovation, right? You're not going to universities and letting that student, have access to something where they might be the next brilliant engineer or person that comes out of all this. So really, I think the global supply side, really reduces the cost per inference dramatically. But that's what I can speak to as far as kind of, why edge-focused, architecture puts kind of, enterprise-grade GPU at the network edge, not locked into a few data centers where you're paying way too much money. So to me, I think that, that's one of the great reasons that our customer base, and Kyle would obviously speak to this much better on the AI enterprise side, are really kind of SMBs, right? SMBs, but meaningful ones, and a lot of them that don't have access to GPU because it's too expensive, right? And now they do.
Honestly, if you say, just to add to that, like if you say the whole business model, right, for Aethir is GPU as a service, right? So as you're able to make compute more accessible, which currently is just in the hands of a few centralized players, you basically open the doors for innovation where, as Paul already pointed out, it's like you have cost advantages there. People don't have to be tied to contracts of like a couple of years or whatever, where they're just stuck, or they might not even need that much compute, right? And let's just assume these college researchers and so on who just want to like experiment for a month, 3 months, 15 days, whatever. They're looking for more flexible options. End of the day, compute remains the same, right? It's the same NVIDIA H200s, H100s. So it's less about the technology here, but it's more about the business model here. How are you making it accessible? How are you opening the doors for innovation for the masses out there? And once you're doing it decentralized with your community who are incentivized with token participation and like governance and all that, people come up with such crazy use cases. They try experimenting so much. You just have to give them, like, compute is like fuel, right? You give them the fuel and they'll give you the rest.
Yeah, and to add to that, all those great points, I think on the decentralized side, if you can scale by aggregating kind of global GPU supply, and I'm talking unused rack servers, idle AI farms, right, or regional data centers, you're getting to a point of resiliency where there's no single point of failure as more nodes come online. So you're kind of, what we try to do is obviously keep those GPUs working all the time. So you're kind of matching the supply with the demand. And that's a fascinating idea, right? Because obviously with lower cost, as Kartik mentioned, and, kind of global edge availability, you're really giving kind of this open access. And so there's no gatekeeping, there's no API limits, all the extra add-ons you have to pay for, or you might get locked in to a centralized supplier with. You better have a really good idea for using all this compute, right? But now with Aethir, you don't really have to, or a decentralized, network that's flexible and scalable, however you want to use it. So I think those are key points in innovation, because you couldn't do that previously. And that just comes down to the big companies kind of, keeping everything for themselves, right? And that's not how it should be, right, in a community-based system.
In the geographic distribution also allows the GPUs to essentially seek out the most efficient way that they can be operated as well, because buying a GPU is one thing, operating it is another, because GPUs require a lot of electricity.
Yeah.
And then when they're in that data center, they also put out a lot of heat. So disposing of the heat is the other big problem of the data center. So we kind of create this market where the GPUs will get deployed in the places where people have access to the most efficient energy infrastructure and the ability to also dispose of that heat generation most efficiently, which I think becomes really interesting as well, which even goes to, I think, a broader point, which is one of the things that enchanted me about DePIN when I first really getting into it is this notion that we're creating a new asset class, really. Kartik, you were describing it as GPUs as a service. I think that's true. Like, you could think of us as like backends as a service or game servers as a service on our DePIN. But something that a lot of DePIN projects, or all of them, or anyone who touches compute really shares in common, is there's this new asset class just around compute, and then creating liquidity around that compute. And that opens up a whole new network of options, because once compute becomes effectively a tradable liquid asset in the same way that energy is, for example, like, look at what we can do with energy now. We have smart grids. You can route energy much more efficiently to the user of energy, even though it obviously doesn't solve all the problems. Energy is a fairly liquid market now. Compute isn't, right? So compute is largely locked up in the capital equipment that you buy yourself, or go to a hyperscaler. They've got millions of servers on tap that they can deploy for you at any given time. But it's not really a liquid market between any of them, because they're all built around like contract lock-ins and APIs that are not necessarily open source, and that try to create the moat so it's harder and harder for you to leave the more and more you build within a given technology silo. Do you guys think about like the changing landscape of what compute will represent in the future as an asset class even?
Yeah, that's a great point, John. You brought that up. This is actually one of my biggest focus right now as one of the special projects. What we're trying to do it, what you just said, right? I'll take a different spin to that. Just think of it as GPU tokenization, right? Web3 world understands real world assets, tokenization, all that. Now, what we are trying to experiment, and we have run like a small pilot of 100K a closed pilot like just last month. We'll be rolling out a couple $1 million initiatives next month with a few players. But the whole idea here is, to your point, you can think of it in multiple ways. Let's say there's a data center who has like compute and they want to take some risk off, right? They can have this Web3 community come in, tokenize the GPUs, have an ownership in that. Basically, now it will be like normal retail people like me or anyone could be like, hey, I own a piece of the GPU, right? So that's like fucking cool in that sense. Then another aspect of it is like what I have seen coming from TradFi, I've seen like nobody in finance actually finances the assets. People in finance the finance, you know? So it's like you can just utilize the cash flows, just implement those same mechanics where instead of tokenizing the assets, you're tokenizing the cash flow. With GPUs, a good thing is, hey, this is what the return profile is going to look like from a supplier perspective. This is what you are going to make in a year. This is your APY, right? Now you can just like model it out, extrapolate it, get the retail, and this retail, you can implement DeFi plus compute, right? Where you are launching some DeFi walls where people come in who understand crypto. They basically lend money on behalf of these compute providers and then just share in the profits, right? Just share in the cash flows. And you can keep like lock-in periods of 3 months, 6 months, 1 year, whatever.
Yes.
Your
You can
profits,
create hedges. You can
exactly.
create hedges, right? Like it happens in energy markets too. Like if you run a business that is highly dependent on stable energy prices, you can purchase option contracts and hedges that help manage things so that if prices skyrocket, you have a stable price, right? So with compute, it's becoming more and more important. So many businesses are essentially a margin on top of compute. So to the extent that that can be stabilized and we can create in our case, we think of it as like an order book. It's an order book for compute. So anybody that meets our standards for a data center, which our data center standards are quite high at Beamable to be a workload provider, but anybody that meets those standards can join us. And it's really you who state what you want to be paid for that compute. And then we operate an order book that says, okay, game studios will find you if the price matches what they're willing to pay. But then that also opens up the other things like options contracts and the financialization of it, which can add further liquidity and the ability to do risk management.
I love what you said there, and because I would argue that Aethir is already kind of in the beginning of doing that, like you said, John. With if GPU providers are staking and renting out compute, and consumers are paying per usage, where pricing becomes like dynamic, transparent, peer to peer, you're kind of already trading commodity in a way. It's like like we were saying, Airbnb, but for real time GPU compute power. To me, it's like if GPU demand now is outpacing supply like oil in the early 1900s, for example, and you have those, like electricity is traded in bandwidth or Mbps, so what would we measure GPUs in, like T-flops per second or VRAM availability per workload? The standardization of the commodity is, once you can quantify that, you can package it and then you can trade it. So I would say we could take this whole thing to the next level and make it very kind of micro, meaning like a kid in Manila could rent the slice of the GPU in Frankfurt and train like an AI app, or there's just so many different ways the community can create liquidity and reduce the geographic monopolies, but it opens the door for more decentralized broker models, right? The ones that you're probably talking about.
Yeah. Terrific. Well, we're reaching the top of our hour. Paul and Kartik, I'd love to give you sort of the closing comments here, let people know where they can go learn more about Aethir, and give us the headline and what you think people really should come away from this conversation understanding about Aethir. But for those of you who have been watching for the last hour, thank you for being here, number one, and especially amongst the live audience. And those of you who asked questions, we're doing these every week now. I do Web3 ones, I do game design ones, I do an AI one, and we're looking forward to having your CTO be on the AI one and talk about all these AI inference use cases that open up with DePIN technology. Beamable is building a DePIN also. Very inspired, I'll have to admit, by some of what we saw at Aethir in terms of your network structure. If you're a game studio that needs game servers, we're there to help support you. If you're interested in the DePIN launch, come to beamable.network and you can learn more about us. Paul, Kartik, take the last word here. What do people need to know about Aethir?
Kartik, I can go, and then Kartik, up to you. I mean, but yeah, for me, I'll just be quick. Decentralized infrastructure, like us, like Aethir, I guess, is not about decentralization for its own sake. In my mind, it's about democratizing AI access, right? Unlocking like the next wave of innovation. Where are those people coming from? Currently that's bottled up by cost, geography, and control. And I think what we do here is the simplest way to explain it is that we want to democratize that access, and that's why I think having community involvement is very important.
Fantastic. Kartik, any final parting thoughts?
Yeah, like honestly, it's as simple as that, right? Anyone needs compute, be it Web 2, Web 3, feel free to reach out to us. We're here to like serve enterprise grade compute use cases. And yeah, the business model is like much more lucrative than a typical Web 2 company, and it's more accessible. This is probably how things are gonna work in the future in terms of business model wise.
Fantastic. Thanks, Kartik. Thanks, Paul. Really appreciate you being here. Hope everyone will tune in for the next episode. So on Tuesday at 3 p.m. Eastern, I've got Bilawal Sidhu, who is a absolutely epic creative technologist. He's got billions of TikTok views. He uses AI all the time to do all kinds of really interesting creative work. He was just at TED interviewing the former CEO of Google, Eric Schmidt. So like we're bringing the best of the best people in this whole industry onto these live streams. So if you're interested in AI, creative technology, gaming, like we will cover it all in this next one on 3 p.m. Tuesday. So tune in then. Until then, Paul, Kartik, come back anytime to talk about any of this stuff. Loved having you on.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
It was great to be here. Have a good day.
All right. Take care, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.